I started as a very small child with a very strong Christian belief, which was drummed into me in school at state expense, day in, day out. There was assembly prayers, there was pre-lunch prayers, there was going home from school prayers, there was a lesson I can only describe as cookery with religion and racist overtones, by which everything you did had a representation of something. This orange represents the world, and this ribbon represents God's love going around the world, and these things represent the four corners of the world. And it was integrated into so many of our lessons in such a destructive way that it was very difficult to actually see it as a separate thing, to pass any judgment on it whatsoever. And we were very, very small children being taught that this was what everybody in the world believed. Our teachers had to pretend to believe it, because otherwise they were going to lose their jobs. Every night before leaving school, I would recite the little ditty, "God keep us safe this night, secure from all our fears, may angels guard us while we sleep, till morning light appears." That was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday we had different words. On Friday my dad got drunk. On Friday my dad beat people up. Well, it was obviously the change in words that was the problem. It was obvious that God was protecting me when I got the words right. This is the seed of a very, very unhealthy psychological dependence on chanting bullshit. It grew gradually over the years more and more extreme, what you'd probably now call a radicalisation. I would always perceive a decision as being made by God. So I would pray about, should I do this or should I do that? And whatever I decided to do, I would decide was the voice of God. And I had to listen to the voice of God, because I had to make sure I'd got that bit right, because I had to have God protecting me, because the world was such an utterly terrifying and dangerous place, and if we didn't, stay exactly on the straight and narrow path, then all hell could break loose. I had the world, by the time I was 6, I was responsible for 4 things: my father's alcoholism, my mother's depression, looking after my baby sister, and Jesus being crucified 2,500 years ago because I'd been naughty sometimes. It's not good for anybody's mental health. It really isn't. I found I believed it. I absolutely believed it. I had had all the proof I needed. I'd had the answers from God. I'd had the protection from God. And then I started to look at my fellow Christians who didn't actually seem to believe it. My dad's an atheist, never went anywhere near a church. Well, that was the proof that God made you good. So if you didn't go to church, you would be bad, evil and aggressive, which isn't actually a fair summary of my father. He has some good points too. But if you went to church, you would somehow be proofed against alcoholism and wife beating, and therefore you'd be a perfectly safe and nice person to know. And as time went on, I tried out different variations of Christianity. I read about different religions. I tried all sorts of variations. And I ended up in a church very much like the ones that have been described here, where there was a lot of emotion, a lot of arm waving, a lot of hearing messages directly from God, and an enormous amount of hypocrisy. And the hypocrisy really struck me. I had listened to really impressive speakers, then you go to a prayer meeting in their home, and they were rude and disrespectful to their partners or unkind to their children. And I was hearing, the fruits of the Spirit are love and wonderfulness and patience and being kind to people, and not actually seeing it. And I got to a point where I decided that the theology, the church, was not for me. I was going to work direct to God, which was, frankly, the path to insanity. At least within the church, there was a sort of somebody to keep me within their official line of what I should be doing. My parents provided on a basic bread and butter level, but I got to the point where I wouldn't set an alarm clock, because if God wanted me to get up, he'd wake me up. I'd go to the bus stop and I'd get on the first bus that came, because obviously that was the bus God wanted me to get on. So when I got to college and had to try to explain to my lecturers why I was late, or why I was there on a Saturday, or my life was just descending into a roller coaster of complete chaos because I was taking my instructions directly from God. I mean, who could possibly overrule that? And it muddles along for a couple of years, with my father being fairly pragmatic and putting on a loud radio to wake me up in the mornings and, dealing with the day-to-day nonsense. But, I still sometimes found myself 15 miles from home, wandering around in circles, convinced that God had sent me to say some particular thing to some particular person, and I must be here for a reason. And I'd somehow managed to retrofit an explanation that, it must have been the person I said hello to at the bus stop really needed someone to say hello to them. That was why I'd had to travel into the middle of nowhere to get completely lost, and just ridiculousness. But it became dangerous. By the time I'd come to my senses, I was living with a man who had quite significant social and mental health issues. I had a child, I had no money, and all I could sort of do by way of problem solving was scream at the ceiling, God, how can you do this to me? Because I'd followed all the instructions. I'd done exactly what I was told to do, and it had not worked. Very obviously and demonstratively had not worked. But I didn't have a clue. I didn't know how to solve the most basic of problems. The idea that if you didn't have any money, you went to got a job, or you went to the job centre. I, had to retrofit all of this from scratch because it had always been a simple question of have a problem, get down on your knees, pray, work out what you'd done wrong, beg for forgiveness for it, and then it would magically get fixed. And probably 6 months of yelling at God, how can you do this to me, I slowly came to the conclusion I wanted nothing more to do with him because it was a git. And a further 6 months I came to the conclusion that perhaps he hadn't been there in the first place. But that still left me with an awful burden of nonsense locked in my head. There was a whole huge list of activities that weren't allowed. Drinking alcohol, dancing, having a skirt above your knees. The list, I could write pages and pages, depending on which church I was at the time, of what was on the forbidden list. But they became frightening activities. I went along to a dance class and sort of stood at the edge, and I didn't quite dare join in because I wasn't sure if it was allowed or not. And this is long after I'd given up the idea that there was a God. It was this entire list of forbidden things were just too scary to actually interact with. And they stayed as a giant barrier to me interacting with my fellow human beings. And eventually I got some basic social skills and a reasonable life going. But I still, 20 years on, have moments where something happens and I revert back to the idea that the problem has been allowed to happen by God because I've done something wrong. The classic example I often give is a situation where I was renting a house and the landlord decided he wanted to cash in on his investment and sell the house. There's a lot of levels to that issue, but my initial response of having to work out what I'd done wrong so I could apologise to God, so that God would fix the situation and put a roof over my head, didn't help. It took me about 10 days to actually get into an estate agent because I was convinced that God had let it happen, God meant it to happen, God intended me to be homeless, and unless I could beg his forgiveness and sort out our religious lack of connection, I wasn't going to get a roof over my head again. And I latched onto the idea that this was caused by me going to a dancing class. And it took half a dozen people, including a charming elderly couple who sat me down and said, "My dear, we've been dancing for 40 years and we own a 3-bed semi." To actually kind of be able to see the wood for the trees and to be able to, that's the sort of long-term damage that it still does. I can remember driving a car with my reasonably recently. I became an atheist when my firstborn was a toddler, and a song came over the radio, and there was a chorus that said something like, "I feel like I'm locked out of heaven." And I didn't consciously respond until I felt my son's hand on my shoulder, and he said, "It's okay, Mum, There is no heaven, so you can't be locked out of it. But can you open your eyes and look at a bloody road? Oh, no. Thankfully, I was driving particularly slowly. I went to open my eyes. My hands had gone white. I was clutching the steering wheel so tightly. It's so deeply entrenched in my brain that it continues to be a psychological problem. It's not a simple question of I wandered out the door and said, bye-bye church, I've now got sense. There is still this default in me that goes back to the idea that any problem is created by my sinfulness and must be fixed by God. Yeah. And I've been an atheist over 20 years, and I still cannot, completely get rid of that.
Wow. I'm going to get a T-shirt that says, God is a git. I won't wear it in my house. And the song is Bruno Mars, Got Me Locked Out of Heaven.